Okay, hello and welcome all to this perspective session. Welcome to everyone joining online and to my incredible panelists. Today, the topic is turning development on its head. But before I go into the details of what we will be talking about and introduce the panelists, I'd like to just give a brief background on the perspective series itself. DGMT's Quarterly Perspective series is a platform designed to bring together civil society, the private sector, and government to exchange insights on pressing social and economic issues. At DGMT, we believe in collaboration and innovation to challenge entrenched patterns, structures, and power dynamics that perpetuate inequality in South Africa. By facilitating bold, solutions-driven conversations, we aim to disrupt the cycles and drive meaningful change. Today's conversation is about looking at place as the starting point for change. Our villages, townships, and neighborhoods are not just backgrounds to people's lives. They are the environments that shape how children grow up, the opportunities they have, and the choices that they make. If we want to change outcomes for people, we need to change the places they live in. I mean, we're all familiar with the expression that someone grew up on the wrong side of the tracks. The idea that children who grow up there, in isiXhosa we say, abantwana bapha, often turn out in a certain way, which indicates that there's a population level norm that tends to be produced in certain places. So today, we pause and we get curious about an approach to shifting the narratives of disadvantaged places, one that goes beyond thinking about a single project or program. It's an approach that doesn't just target the individual while leaving untouched the environments that produce their disadvantage. We're looking into a development approach that recognizes that disadvantage is reproduced through the systems and relationships in a place, and seeks to transform the local ecosystem so that everyone growing up there has a better chance. This panel will give language to what is this approach and how does it work and why does it matter? From my own perspective, why does this conversation matter and now? Well, firstly, because where you grow up has a profound impact on your lived realities as an adult. And secondly, while many are working to change outcomes through national reforms, it's quite evident that these efforts don't always land meaningfully in the places that we call home, in our communities. And so if transformation cannot only be delivered top-down, we must ask what ways of working bottom-up truly deliver the kind of transformation communities need. Okay, all right, enough from me. I'd like to turn the conversation over to our panelists and to you, the audience. I'd like to first encourage the audience to please submit your questions and comments in the chat box throughout the conversation. At the end, we'll leave about 5 minutes or so for our panelists to respond to some of your questions. To you, my exceptional panelists, I'd like you to just briefly each introduce yourselves. I'll start with you, Réjane, because you are front and center in my screen.
My name is Réjane, and I'm the co-founder and director of the Bulungula Incubator. The Bulungula Incubator is a rural development organization where our work began more than 21 years ago in a very remote part of South Africa, in the Eastern Cape. The South Africans would know what the former Transkei region is, which is on the wild coast of the Eastern Cape. And under apartheid, it was designated as a black homeland, which meant that it was incredibly under-resourced in terms of any kind of infrastructure. So whether it was roads, electricity, sanitation, access to healthcare, access to education, anything that anybody needs to have a chance at living a flourishing human life was not accessible to communities. And that is where our work began, as I said, more than 2 decades ago, and where we now have a place-based strategy that we call preconception to career. So from a healthy pregnancy all the way through to a productive and flourishing adulthood and family life.
Sure. Thanks, Réjane. Over to you, Johan.
Thanks, Sinazo, and thank you, everybody, and welcome, everybody, also. I'm the Executive Director for a non-profit company called Ranyaka. We are an urban planning non-profit, active in about 38 communities across the country at the moment. And I think, like we all are here, it's place-based, people-centered. How do we take a place and build a thriving community and a thriving economy? I think that those two cannot go separately. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Ngaka.
Hi, good day, everyone. My name is Ngaka Mosiane. I work for the Gauteng City-Region Observatory, which is located at the University of the Witwatersrand. Our work, basically, all of us in the organization, we focus on the Gauteng City region as our object of study as a research institution. And personally, I do actually quite a number of economic issues that I'm interested in, social issues, whether it could be like issues around mining communities, and also even importantly, spatial issues. But all of those, I tend to approach them from the peripheries entry point.
Oh, thanks. Welcome, Ngaka. Danya, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sinazo, and thank you all so much for having me. My name is Danya Pastuszek. I join you from the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation in Canada. I am a mother, I am a daughter, I am the ancestors of brilliant people from Ukraine and Poland and other places I'm probably not aware of. And I'm the steward right now at Tamarack Institute for Community Engagement. We are based in Canada. We have the privilege to work all over the world and with over 200 communities here in Canada. Those communities are neighborhoods, they're cities, they're rural and remote areas, they're regions, they're First Nations. We are all about the power of collaboration to end poverty in its many, many forms. We help people get collaboration ready. We support, as I mentioned, these 200 amazing place-based partnerships, and we try to bring those amazing people and places together to have an influence on the policies and the narratives that shape their worlds. So thanks again so much for having me.
Sure. Thank you and welcome again to this exceptional group of people who have joined as panelists. Those were such rich introductions, and I'm so excited that we're in good hands to have this conversation. I think the question that most people have as front and center for them is really, what is a place-based approach? What is place-based work? And so maybe we should start at that point of clarifying definition. But I do want to say that the truth is there actually isn't a definition, a standard definition for what place-based approach to this to development is, but there is rather consensus around what are common features of working in a place-based way in order to solve social, economic, and ecological disadvantage. And so, yeah, these features can include long-term outcomes focused or dealing with interconnectedness. But I would like Danya, somebody who has sort of been quite involved in field building in this area of work, can you just unpack a little bit, what are some of these common features of what place-based work is, and what distinguishes it from more programmatic approaches that just land in place?
You know, what you said around consensus is really interesting to me. I think one of the reasons why it's nearly impossible and why we shouldn't even want to have one definition of place is that there is an abundance of so many things in local places. And one of the things there's abundance of is creativity and the way that different people perceive where they are and who they're with. And I find again and again that It's that abundance of creativity and that abundance of seeing and experiencing the world differently that is what makes the definition of place so unique and special in every place. I think of place as mindset, a narrative, a way of working. Again, I think the definition needs to be set by the people who are collaborating in their place, and that the process and the holding of that shared definition is a really important part of a place-based approach. That said, Sinazo, like you said, there are a few features of place-based approaches that we see at Tamarack when we look at how countries, how regions, and how localities are holding place-based work. So I'll list 8. I'll be brief, I promise. The first one, I think, is more important now than ever before. The feature is around growing and expanding aspirations and perceptions. I find that when people come together, there's such an opportunity to understand different possibilities for where and how we can influence change. I was in a conversation yesterday with policy experts where there were 3 ideas around basic income and income poverty that I'd never even thought of, but that really expanded my horizons of what might be possible in the place we were talking about. So the feature that I love is around growing and expanding aspirations and perceptions. The second one is that, as you said, it's not one single thing. It's a way of thinking, of telling stories and of doing. It's a suite of strategies, and it's about, as I said, focusing on the right part in the system, the right leverage point. The third thing I see is it's about, as you said, partnering and about shared design. In place-based approaches, solutions are co-created with communities, not for them. They involve people with lived experiences of the harm and oppression that the community is trying to address, but they also make space for people who are in the systems that are perpetuating those harms because they have such a special vantage point and ability to influence them. The fourth thing we see is that it's so much about shared stewardship. It is a collective act of care. The responsibility to do the work, the attribution of credit is distributed across so many people, always with communities at the center. But that collective action is really critical. Related to that, the fifth thing we notice is that it's so much about a shared accountability. It's not about finger pointing and saying that, your institution or your sector is responsible for all these issues. It's about stepping back and seeing what's the combination of issues and contributions that are creating where we are could be each of our most powerful roles to unmake and remake what we have right now. It's about focusing on a result. The work's pointed on really audacious and important and community-driven goals. Success is measured by real change in the well-being of living things, not just by outputs or deliverables or short-term goals and responses. The sixth thing we see is that it's so much about validating different perspectives and roles, and about speaking across lines of difference, not trying to collapse those differences, and not giving up or stepping away or retreating or getting defensive when inevitably the differences start to emerge. And then finally, it's about joy. I love this work because I see how impactful it is, but I also love it because of the friendships and the love that it creates for people who take part. I find that these approaches are really about nurturing well-being for the participants in the work in the short term, while also trying to create and contribute to broader well-being in the longer term. The last thing I want to say is just that I think place-based approaches are a return to what's instinctual and what existed, for millennia before we got to our current moment in time. I'm learning how to be a better student of nature, and I was out by the river here a couple of days ago, and I was looking at that river, and I was noticing that so many things in this riverbed are in reciprocity with each other, grow and die because of the relationships that they have, some of which we can see above the ground and some of which we can't see because they're below ground. But I think that place-based approaches have reemerged. I think they were very much part of what we once had, and they're very much part of other living systems that surround us. And it's gotten a name in the last couple of decades in response to systems that aren't working. In response, like you said, to the reality that individual programs and reforms, even if they're really well-intentioned, often land in communities without actually shifting the systems that shape lives. But I think it's important to remember that it's instinctual. I don't believe that we have to learn how to work in these ways. I believe it's in all of us. And we just have to pause long enough to surface what's already there.
Sure. That was really helpful. I really like the idea that, yeah, I think the way you are articulating it has got both beautiful balance of the heart of what makes us human and be able to live and create together, but then also a rigor. I think there tends to be kind of some apprehension, and for right reasons in some instances, about handing the work of change back to the actors of the place. But what you've articulated has also kind of, yeah, provided like some real solid kind of guardrails that enable that that process to be meaningful. This idea of shared accountability. It's not just, and being results focused, etc. I really, really appreciate that. I think to move to the next part, which is, well, why is this approach needed? And I'd like to throw a question at you, Johan, first, which is, having worked in local government, in urban and town planning, to now doing this work in an NPC, why, in your view, is this place-based approach needed in South Africa and right now? And what were the gaps that you saw in your other spaces that this approach is filling to enable community transformation?
Yeah, thanks very much. And I want to sort of connect with what Danya also said. It's such a human thing. We connect with where we grew up, as you've said. We remember it. It's a memory that's in us, but it also influences us. Because space is more psychological, also ecological, and of course physical. So the way we must think through it is, especially now in our country, where we haven't really built anything new. And we need to connect back to the purpose of place where people can really connect. I think with places that respect them and their past, places that provide for their present needs, and in places that holds for their future also. And that pride and belonging and the trust that goes into a thriving space, I think it's something critically that we need in a country at the moment. There's a lot of people trying to do things, but if we can connect where we stay and where we live and our reality, I think that can really help us quite a lot in terms of just the purpose of place. I think the role of place is, it's not just a passive holder or sometimes just a geography or a name on a map. It's a facilitator, I think, of a lot of people, aligns people's actions, the resources, the systems that we want to do. And it can actually turn a lot of those fragmented efforts and well-intended efforts, I think, to a much more integrated long-term approach that can really give everybody a space, but just allow a little bit of a framework that we know where we're moving, and space is perfect for framework. I think the last one in terms of the gaps, if we have that sort of thinking around place and the spaces that they hold, I think it can really start to integrate across the sector. And we don't always think about top-down, bottom-up as separate things. I think we need both. We need a bit of top-down policy sometimes, and we need a bit of bottom-up action. But I think a good place-based approach integrates, as I say, across the sectors. It restores trust and stewardship. I think, as Danya has also said, it enables genuine participation because it's in your face, it's in your street or in your town, and it creates that ecosystem that we can sustain our growth. So I don't necessarily think it's different than other approaches. I'll rather see it as it's a platform to allow a different number of approaches to do what they do well. And I think that's what our country needs at the moment quite a lot, yeah.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, you're so right. These binaries are not helpful, and we must be cautious not to say this again versus others. Absolutely. Réjane, I wonder if you would have anything to add in building the case for this way of working and this approach coming from a rural context. How would you kind of build that case? Why does it matter?
Thanks, Sinazo. You know, I find it always interesting when you have conversation about place-based, that place-based practitioners, like we all are here, is that when people say, well, what is place-based? And I say, well, for place-based practitioner, that's a wrong question, because there are lots of different whats, you know, it depends on the situation. So place-based, always, the question you want to answer is, how do you do it? It's always about a how, because that, I think, is what sets place-based apart from other development strategies. And the title of this webinar is so apt, where it says turning development on its head, because often when you think about development, people want to know, well, what are you doing in education? What are you doing in healthcare? What are you doing in job creation? I'm like, that's not the question for us. The question for us is how we do things. And we like to think about how we do place-based. And Danya spoke a lot about how you do what it is that you do, right? You do it with heart, you do it by pausing, you know, and understanding before you act. And that is embedded in place-based work. And we like to think of an acronym which we say place-based work goes FAR, and FAR standing for familiarity. So familiarity and proximity is crucial for place-based. That's what's essential here, is that we try to understand, and we work with communities to understand the place that we're at, and how does this particular program outcome, whether it's an early childhood development program, a vaccine immunization program, a youth job creation program, how do we understand what the challenges are in this place? So it's familiarity, number one. Number two, it's accountability. So deep accountability to our organizations, to our communities, to the individuals, to being person-centered, which was what Johan brought up as well, is that we are ultimately person-centered. So we don't care that much about your program outcome, is we care about the person-centered outcome. So accountability is very important, because we have to be accountable directly to the individuals and to the communities, not to the program. And then the R standing for responsiveness, you know, responding to, we have designed so many programs over the years that had a lot of input into how their program design happened, and got completely turned on its head because something else happened. And we had to redesign, and it was then better because of the way that we take time, we take our pauses, and we bring along those that are wanting to come along with us. So that's why we always say place-based has to go far, being that acronym that starts for familiarity, accountability, and responsiveness.
Sure. I like that you've actually nudged us to the how, because exactly that's where I think I'd like the bulk of this conversation to now go, and that those acronyms are really helpful kind of start really to also understand some of this. I wonder for you, Johan, maybe to start with you. I know that Ranyaka has kind of, in its how, created a model and a framework with structures, etc. And you are working at scale. I wonder in your, how do you balance that kind of model and structure with process and planning with this, what is clear that place requires a level of emergence and holding emergence of what the place is needing, and adaptability, the responsiveness that Réjane was talking about, so how do you balance that? And also, given the scale that you are operating at, to Réjane's point of this proximity and how important that is, how do you also hold that in your own approach?
It's quite a big question, but
quite a big question.
Try. Yeah, I think what we've all said for us in terms of the space, we always said, look, guys, it's about a mindset, the headspace. It's about your values, your heart space, and then it's about quality of space so that we can get a thriving place. So I think, and we always the balance between too much structure, too little structure, too organic, not organic. All those things is quite key, I think, is to get that balance right, because we are trying to move forward. So we need to put some structure down or some familiarity for people to see, well, this is a rhythm that I can follow. So I don't know, through our experience and the deep lessons and sometimes burning our fingers, we've not come to fall let me call them the architectures or the building blocks, clubs and the hubs, the networks that we built, and then of course the platform. And we just see at the moment the clubs are really where people can get together and talk about the things that they really care about and that's close to them. And clubs is a notion that's familiar with people. It's a little bit different from your forum sometimes, which is a little bit more political. So it seems at the moment, if clubs are a very nice mechanism to get people together around a specific topic that's close to them, and that we can really start to look at the mindset and the values, the hard things in the mind. And then the hubs is really those anchor points, I think, where people, especially in our townships these days, safe and clean and just nice to be at, is these anchors where people can go, get services, get opportunities, get skills, start to talk to each other. And again, get a familiarity of how Thrive looks. It was quite important for us if we say something is thriving, or how does it look and feel and in a way nearly smell. So we're starting to roll that out. And I think the networks are critical because we learn a lot. And if we can start to shift those learnings and the memories across all our hubs, for example, that we can just start to share what really worked for people and what resonates with people, that's critical for us. And there's so many actors. So if we can get some of these actors in the correct network, or the thing that allows people to really get things done in the way they want to get it done. And of course, the economy. The network is crucial for our economies and to really build these local economic systems. And then the digital platforms is difficult sometimes. But I think we need that platforms to start to capture the data so that we can make really informed decisions also in terms of on-the-ground type of information and data. And we're also starting to look how does that platform can drive incentives to be part of your community and to share what you've learned and what you need to do. So it's a combination between the sort of architecture, get the clubs going, get the hubs in place, build the network, share the data, and then the mindset and the heart of people. We've just seen that you can do what you want, but if the trust is not there, the relationship is not there, it's very, very difficult. Now, fortunately, those are in the hard stuff, so they scale quite easily. Because people understand it doesn't matter where you stay or what you do, you understand that hard thing very, very quickly. And I think that's what's driving our scale at the moment. Not necessarily all the structures, that's critical, but people starting to share their stories, their confidence and their memories. I think that's going to help us to really, really scale this thing that we're busy with here. It's a living framework at the end that we're trying to build here with people together with them here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely taking that message, right? This, the flexibility to treat this as a living framework. That's such a good place to close what you were saying. Ngaka, as somebody who's, from a research perspective, studied particularly what's happening in the places in Gauteng that are in the peripheries, what kind of themes emerge from your own research that are recommendations for policymakers, investors, about how they can approach transforming and enabling meaningful transformative change in these places? You're still on mute, sorry.
Okay, thank you, Sinazo. So, I mean, I think we can actually start with some of just the basic stuff. In my area of work on spatial transformation, we do talk about different dimensions of spatial transformation, and we can go into different levels of those dimensions. But just one very basic one is basically what one could really call just the universal basic services. That really contributes quite a lot because they provide resources to people to do what they actually initiate themselves to do, what they create, what they think is actually quite feasible in their own context. So just that particular point, water, electricity, roads, and all of that really become important resources for livelihood formation. But then I think the other thing in terms of really what can be done and what's been done is really is based mainly on what we see already happening. And a number of things are already happening in this really. And I think I might maybe broadly contextualize in this particular South African context, where the expectation, like for example, in 1994, was that with the walls of apartheid falling down, a lot of people from the peripheries, from the rural areas in the former homelands, will move towards the metropolitan areas of Durban, eThekwini, Nelson Mandela, Gqeberha, Gauteng, and others. But what we have actually seen happening, especially if you like between 2011 and 2022, based on the stats SA, there's been like a 23% increase in people moving there. And if you can compare that earlier in the process, 2001 and 2011, we only had like 3% increase in those areas. So actually, increasingly, people are actually, if you like, seeing the options of actually living in the peripheries being better for them to be able to cope with their in their everyday life. And actually, that seems to be actually contrasting with the urban growth a little bit. Between 2001 and 2011, we saw 26% increase in cities, but then only 19% 2011 and 2022. So there's been a lot of investment in sort of like housing. People like really investing, saying this is creating, if you like, this former homelands, Bantustans, into some kind of homes for themselves. But alongside that, there's also been some kind of like private sector investments in terms of like shopping malls, shopping complexes in those areas. And then one of the most important thing for me that seems to be emerging out of that is now just the way in which these areas, as they beginning to aggregate, to grow, especially in terms of the built environment, is the planning part of it that actually can be either very much creating conditions which are very dangerous to people as they walk around doing their everyday for their everyday lives, or they can actually be facilitated to really become generative spaces for social, economic, and cultural sort of like creativity and development. So I think for me, it's like whatever that should happen should be based exactly on that, on what people are already doing. So sort of like helping, coming in, making interventions in these spaces in ways that facilitate development. And that can really, like I said, it's really, for me, the most bottom line is become like spatial design that actually become facilitative and that becomes a generative of socio-economic development.
Sure. Thank you, Ngaka. One of the ways that is coming up about how to do this work is this idea of collaboration, working together with the people of the place, them working together with each other. And I want to go beyond the buzzword and get a little deeper about how do you do that well? I mean, I think a lot of people have tried to collaborate and enable collaborative change, but it's hard. And so I wondered, Danya, can you share a little bit about how place-based collaboratives are established, how they are, how they work, what makes them work? Yeah, and if you could go into the things that people don't maybe talk enough about in terms of what really makes this collaborative way of delivering change key, and one of the key features in this work.
Absolutely. A huge question. I feel like the question that maybe many of us here in this space have devoted our lives to. I'm sure that our audience has amazing thoughts as well. So perhaps we'll see some responses to your questions in our chat function, but I'll give it a try. So the first thing that comes to me when I think about the how is that it's about acknowledging that so much of the how isn't visible. Like you said, it's incredibly rigorous. It often looks like sending out meeting invitations and facilitating a conversation and sending notes after. But that's not really work. The work is of convening a group of humans in ways that allow them to bring their gifts and passions into the conversation and that make the conversation accessible to them. So there's a tremendous amount of art, human-centered art involved in the how of this work. It's about naming what's possible. It's about really taking time to name where we are right now, why we're there and why we're so far away from what's possible and what's available for us to change it. And then it's about making sure that the people who are in the room can affect that change, or who can are people who can get to the people who can affect the change. We talk a lot about building a shared agenda, but I want to say a little bit about what that shared agenda in our experience needs to hold. It needs to hold the goal. It needs to hold the truth of who's furthest from that goal and the specific equity gaps that we need to address if we're going to get to the goal. It needs to be rooted in local priorities and local assets. And it needs to create the conditions for people to work together across difference. In terms of what we've found makes collaboratives effective, I'll share, I think, 5 things. And the first is that we need to recognize that place is really layered. I haven't met one person doing place-based work who doesn't have some amount of trauma tied to their place. We talk at Tamarack a lot about the power of place, but when we say that, we don't mean to say anything about how people have come to be or have come not to be in their places. Some of us are in our places because of just relentless advocacy in the face of really oppressive efforts to remove us. Others are here because of decisions that their families were able to make that brought them to where they are. Others are in their places because of displacement or economic realities. And some of us are in places that we love, but that have been really underinvested from a financial capital perspective. Many Indigenous people living on low incomes or no wages are not in the places that they want to be or that their ancestors know best. Sometimes these places are just in their memories. So I just want to say that when we talk about place, it's not meant to be any kind of assumption about why people are where they are. It's much more about what we can do in the places that we find ourselves. And it has to be about changing the norms and the laws that create inequitable access to choices about what we call our places, and about being there for the people that we're working with and creating spaces and roles that are right for them and that are reflective of maybe harms they've experienced or might still be experiencing. If any of you are a child of the 90s like I am, you might remember the musical genius Mos Def. Mos Def has an amazing line where he says, "There's grief here, there's peace here, it's easy and hard to be here." And I always come back to that when I think about this dimension of how we work in place. The second piece of the how is really starting with trust and building empathy, not tactics. You know, together we go far. Réjane, I think you said that a couple of minutes ago. But when we start with understanding who's in the room and what they want and what support they need and what amazing gifts they bring, it's much easier a couple of months down the line to do the work of getting to the work when we set that foundation of really seeing and hearing one another and seeing and hearing those that we're doing work in service of. We can't always be in the rooms where the work is happening. I really think that relationships are infrastructure, and without that infrastructure, we can't get to the work. So the how is building that relational infrastructure. Third, like Réjane said, I think co-creating the agenda is really important. I've also been in many conversations where I thought I had a good sense of what needed to happen. When we brought that back to community to validate what we thought we heard and what we thought we knew, the agenda completely changed. And that's okay. We have a responsibility in our how to, when we talk about co-creation, listen really well, look at what's already been offered before asking people to offer it again, because so often consultation has already happened. Boldly putting together what we think needs to happen, but then going back and creating feedback loops to validate and not getting into the work until we're pretty certain that we've got it close to good enough for the moment. It's really about building shared ownership everyone needs to see themselves as part of the solution, not just as contributors to someone else's plan. All of us need to hold humility when it comes time for the social media post or the press release or the big report, that it's more important that everyone gets named for their contribution than that all of my contributions get named. There's a great amount of humility that underscores the how, I think, of this work. I think, fourthly, investing in backbone support, the coordination, the communication, the data tracking, these things don't just happen by accident. So really getting clear on which organization or associations and people are going to hold those functions is really important. And then my last piece of how will be about investing in networking. Zachariah, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, in the chat is asking about cross-border collaborations. I think is part of investing in place. I'm finding that especially now, looking beyond the place where we're doing our work into being part of and creating and nurturing networks of places that may be able to affect levers of change when they come together. And at the very least can make the work, as my dear colleague Liz Weaver used to say when she was with Tamarack, more effective and more efficient, because we have the benefit of being able to learn from each other and hold each other up and nurture each other on the hard days.
Sure. I'm hearing in different ways consistent themes across what is being said. A lot of what Réjane was pointing to about familiarity and proximity, and how you're describing that is then unearthing the trauma and the history of the place. I wonder, Réjane, off the back of that, if you would want to add a bit more nuance to your FAR framework. If you're thinking about accountability, who is accountable to who? How do you enable that accountability? I mean, in a lot of communities, a lot of change doesn't happen because often there is a blaming of others, and then that obviously gets a lot of people not to even come into the room. And so how do you mesh all of the things that are emerging about trust building, being informed by context and all of these things, to actually then also do this accountability? How do you get that to work right when there is all of that happening around it? And why often people don't want to enter the conversation when they are going to be made to be accountable in the traditional sense? What is the kind of accountability you're referring to that's different? And maybe even to the other elements of your acronyms, if there's more that you'd want to add.
Sure, absolutely. I think a key overarching dimension that I don't think is appreciated enough and thought about enough is the time variable. Just because there are urgent problems to solve doesn't mean we can do it quickly. Even if we want to do it quickly, it might not be the right thing to do things in a short period of time, or do them in the time frame that we expect at the start of launching a project or an intervention, or even designing it and thinking with all our stakeholders, whether it's our communities, whether it's our funders, our board of directors, anybody that we might be accountable, is understanding that doing things properly often takes much more time than what you think, and that giving yourself, often people come and they say, my intervention's not working, and I'm like, your intervention's great, it's just not working yet. And I think appreciating that things take time in everything that Danya's talking about the collaborations, about the meetings, about getting people in the room, about being accountable, to building trust, that takes a lot of time. And one thing that we've certainly appreciated in what we've done within Bulungula, where our work started, was just how long it takes for different processes to become embedded, for you to understand how to solve a problem, why you're doing it, and then getting it right is not because of anything that you might have needed to change in your planning, but that you had to change in your expectations. So that was one important point that I wanted to make there. That's important. And then specifically around your question of accountability, I think when people think about accountability, they often think about sometimes an us and them, you know, who's accountable to whom. But I think with place-based is to understand that there are no others, that we all have to be on the same team, that we have to be moving towards a truly shared goal and outcome, and that we have to, again, if you take the right amount of time and you give processes time to unfold and to have your feedback loops and to allow yourself to fail and to learn from failing. In fact, failing is an essential part about getting something right, because allowing yourself to fail and saying, you know, we're not going to get all of this right. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about their lives. This is complex, and we learn from failure. I mean, for example, one of the interventions and projects that often, and certainly in South Africa, and I'm assuming globally as well, is often entrepreneurship programs are the hardest to get right, because they need to fail. You need to take risk. You need to say, I'm going to try out this particular kind of business and I'm going to let it fail so that we can all learn about what doesn't work, you know, and being okay with that, and then taking the time and saying, okay, if this doesn't work, you know, again, I'm accountable to all my stakeholders, but going back and having that humility again and saying, you know, we got to go back to the drawing board and we got to go together. And then when it comes to also being, you know, having your values, going back to a set of values that allows you to engage, you know, like, for example, in the funding world, right? You've got a funder as a partner who should be a partner, not an external stakeholder, but a funder as a partner, saying that, you know, this is, you might be focused on a particular healthcare intervention, right? Because you focused on TB, right? So TB might not be the thing that's the biggest health concern in our community. So therefore, we're focusing on something else. We're focusing on hypertension, or we're focusing on HIV, you know. So just because the funding's coming from there and the stats that you've got to fill in are TB stats, you've got to do the work with your funders. And we found that conversation has started to change quite a lot in understanding that with place-based, because we take more time in order to get our outcomes, because they're person-centered, you then have got to shape how stakeholders see what does success look like and what does success mean. And that helps you also to then shape you know, your questions about accountability and about responsiveness. And that place-based organizations need to be allowed to be flexible, because the outside stakeholders often don't know what is best for that particular community and what's best. And to have that conversation, have the difficult conversations. It's not that we didn't succeed, but we succeed in a different way because we didn't understand, and we have that humility to say we didn't understand what it is we were doing in the beginning, but now through a process we understand, and it's taking much longer. And if you're not on board with that, well, then you're not the right partner. And being able to say, you're not necessarily a place-based partner. Just because you're an education partner doesn't mean you're a place-based partner, even if we're doing education, because our outcomes are different to the kind of outcomes that you want. And I think that is the kind of work that is essential for place-based practitioners to do, is to really start to bring that understanding to the field, that it is different because how we do things is different where we're placed.
Sure. I see Danya loving that particular point, and I think it is a critical one, and one that in practice is actually quite hard because of power dynamics and different orientations. And I guess keen to understand, how do you get that right with funders, and how do you, and particularly, maybe I can throw it to you, Johan, first. Sorry, Danya, I know that you liked it, but as somebody who works in the South African context and with largely private sector funders who have a particular orientation, yeah, how do you get alignment on this approach that has emphasis on process, emphasis on mindset and values and time, emergence, when a funding logic tends to have, yeah, it can be different. Can you just share a little bit about how you navigate that?
They always ask these difficult questions. I'm not sure anybody has got it right yet. It's a very difficult thing. Unfortunately, the way that we still govern and finance and measure a lot of what we do is still based on I think a bit of an old school type of thing, more programmatic, more projects. So it's really, really difficult to shift in a sort of that practical way. I think where we had successes is the one funder that we do have, we just brought them to the place where we're working, and they met the people, and there was basically no projects at all. But I think it's just connecting with people and seeing the passion of people. And I think they love where communities are organized also, that they can really see, because they've got mandates and they've got a lot of regulatory stuff. So if they make a misstep somewhere, they're in trouble. So they don't want to just enter into something, especially if we talk place-based. I think all of us have said it's very layered, it's very time consuming. Sometimes you think you're 2 steps ahead, but you're actually 3 steps back. So I think where we did get successes is really the guys that don't ask, is it working? Because there's no switch for this thing, like a bulb that you switch on and it's working. But it's those guys that understand that if we say, I don't know if it's working, but we're moving together in the right way or in the right direction. I think that's a type of, I think Réjane also said that that's a type of funder that we're looking for. But unfortunately, we'll have to break down a bit of barriers around, as I say, measurement and finance and regulatory things if we want to give the funders more space. The other successes with more at the local level, your local SPAR or your local filling station or your local bookshop, they are not that much messy into regulation necessarily. And they connect much, much easier with the local, because they know a lot of the local people. They understand the context much, much better. So I think that's sort of the other successes. I think at the moment, we're a little bit more ahead than some of the bigger corporate investors. But there are definitely some of them that are looking for this type of work, and it starts to understand long-term doesn't mean quick now, as I think everybody has said now, yeah.
Sure. Danya, I'd like to know what Réjane was saying really sparked alignment for you, and if you've got anything to kind of share to expand on that.
Well, I couldn't get to my heart emoji fast enough, but Johan, so much of what you just shared sparked alignment as well, and I was hardening not to add, but just to express, I'm learning. I'm deepening what I thought I knew. Réjane, what you said around just because you're an education partner doesn't mean you're a place-based partner really resonated. Again, I'm thinking a lot these days about how we expand our aspirations and our perceptions. And I think one way that, to whoever asked about global partners and global partnership, one thing we can do, and I'd love to be a part of with all of you in doing globally, is thinking about how do we expand the perception that place-based work and really grounding in community is as important in a lens for how we approach our work as our love for early childhood education or poverty reduction or anything else. This how is really important. Johan, what you said about our opportunity and the need to recognize that funders and all people in all roles and all sectors have barriers. Some of them are real, some of them are perceived, but working together to give funders more space and break down the barriers that they have is really important. I would just emphasize that I think the work right now, if we're really going to make place-based approaches the norm, has to be about building ecosystems. It has to be about connecting across country borders and regions and places to learn from one another. It has to be about recognizing where are the constraints that different sectors experience, expanding every sector's and every person's conception of the role that they can play, and getting really technical to figure out what is the lever of change to address the regulatory barriers. What are the narrative changes that we need to put into place to help communities see that they can have such a broader role in capital than just accessing it, that they can shape how it's accessed, what it's used for, how it's thought of, and who holds it and builds it.
Sure. I would like, even though Johan said this idea of evidence, is it working, can be quite a slippery thing to hold. But I would like to ask, what are the markers that this approach has any merit? What, from your own experience and field, are you seeing that tells you this works? And what are the things that, what are maybe the non-traditional indicators but it's some indicators that are quite unique to what you guys are describing, right? Should we be looking at? And I'd like to start off with you, Réjane, because I know that you guys have done a lot of work in Bulungula around especially kind of population level monitoring and evaluation, but I think a bit more than that too.
Yeah, thanks. You know, so ours is very, very deep place-based work in a rural, particular rural area, and since then it's scaled through partnerships, and some of the learnings are getting into policy places and working with other national partners. But really, where we started is the reason why our person-centered outcomes are so much part of the DNA of what we do. So the Bulungula Incubator was born out of a crisis situation where, because of lack of access to clean drinking water, there was no municipal or government provided water at all, and people were only using natural water, ground springs. And we found that more than half of households had lost at least one child to diarrhea. 1 in 9 had lost 3 or more, and I know families had lost 8, 9 children. So it was this crisis response that started off with buying water tanks for access to clean drinking water. That's how the Bulungula Incubator was born. And then it grew from there into the strategy that it has today, and into the organization that it is today. And because of that, it wasn't about any particular program. We didn't start trying to do an education program or a health program. We started to improve people's lives. And so we developed what we call a person-centered database, which particularly looks at how is this individual, so it's mapped into a household, it's geographically mapped as well, and it looks at all the different programs that household. So if you look at a particular child, how is the child connected to the household? How many family members are employed? Does this child go to an early learning center? Has this particular child had an immunization? Does mom have access to the HIV medication that you might need? Is the brother on a job skills program? And so because you have this mapping in a household that's person-centered, you understand what does that particular person need, not what program do we have that we want to apply to this household or involve the household in. So I mean, of course, I can give you many, many examples, but just one example that comes to mind, you know, when a grandmother came to our clinic, which we set up, there was no clinic at all. We've set it up with the local community. It's now in partnership with the Department of Health 10 years after we built it. And the grandma came in, spoke to the nurse and was, you know, in tears and said, I don't have any food for when I have to take my HIV drugs because we don't have access to the government child grant. You know, it's a bureaucratic issue. I need help with that. And then we spoke with the home-based care worker who goes to that household. And the home-based care worker said, the problem isn't about the social grant, is that the grandma should be on the alcohol harms program. So you've got a different intervention that was needed in the household in order to solve the problem. You didn't need the social worker to come with the forms that needed to be filled in. You needed to offer the alcohol harms program because that's what the household needed. And so understanding what the need is, and our M&E systems, because of course our approach, you know, we've spoken a lot about, you know, what sounds like, you know, we've spoken about love and humility and getting people together. So it sounds very soft, you know, and touchy-feely, but actually the results are data-driven, and the results they need to be data-driven. And you find that what comes from, emerges from the ground. I mean, another example which shows how, you know, when we talk about our strategy, we talk about scaling deep, which is scaling deep into communities. That's the place-based strategy, the preconception to career strategy. Then there's scaling up, which is informing policy, and scaling out. You know, there are different ways of scaling, and scaling out is when you have partnerships with other organizations to have a broader impact for what you do. And so when we look at the data that we have and what we're seeing on the ground that then informs policy and scales out is, for example, in our early childhood development program, in the preschools that we work on, where we're scaling deep, we found that we were getting very good child outcomes in our preschools, but preschools that were just you know, down the coast were not getting the same, but they should have been, because it's the same communities, the same type of environment, and there was a big difference in the results. And we said, okay, well, what worked with our preschools is that we got teachers together on a Friday to work on their teacher strategies, and then the Thrive by 5 index, which just came out last week, found that the biggest driver on ECD outcomes was teacher strategies. But we had already knew that, and we were already implementing something, and we already have an ECD community of practice that's particularly around teacher strategies. But we've been doing it for 3 years before Data Drive got the results in the index, you see. And so that's why when we talk about scale in place-based, don't think about scale in the traditional way. Think about scale in 3 years. And in fact, this framework came from the Tamarack Institute. There's a paper that Danya would know about, that the Tamarack Institute wrote about scaling out, scaling up, and scaling deep. And that framework was very helpful to us, I must say, Danya, because it helped us to give a framework to this thinking we were doing already, but we didn't have the language, we didn't have the framework. So thank you so much. A real shout out to Tamarack Institute on that work, which has helped us a lot.
Sure. Johan, would you add anything to that in terms of how we think about the evidence that informs that this way of working and approach, works?
Yeah, I think then I just can agree with Réjane also. I think where we started is, if we want to build ecosystem, we need to measure ecosystems. So we started more at the community level. Let's just get a baseline in place. After all the research and things, there's 4 critical pillars. As you guys know, it's your local economy, how strong is it, can it provide jobs, skills. It's people, mental, physical, and spiritual health that we really need to see where it is. Quality space. Infrastructure, is it safe, is it clean? And then the last one, of course, is how well communities work together. Can they trust their neighbor? So we started there, and then we went down to more household level, where I think Réjane also, and we're now busy, Réjane, with more looking at the individual, so maybe we can learn from each other also. So we try to sort of get those 3 layers in place. What was difficult is to connect the different things, because it's an ecosystem, so things could influence each other in different ways. So we had to look at how we can work that out and see how it works without being too structured. Again, making space for the organic growth also. But I think the real thing, I think, Réjane, also, we talk a lot about massive, small. It's the small victories. One story, we've worked with a community, it was very hard, and we just thought we're not going anywhere, and we need to drive the meetings every time. And it was late at night, I got to the meeting, and for the first time they said, Johan, don't worry, go sit there, put the kettle on so long, we're covering, we busy with the meeting. So those small little victories, for me, is a huge measurement of where people are starting to take responsibility. So I think the measurement and the success, yes, data is critical, the evidence, it's the small victories at a personal level for people. And because it's space, you at least need to see some physical change also. And that's sometimes the easier one, people clean streets and everything, but to do it consistently, that's the difficult thing. So no, evidence is crucial, but it's not just hard data. There's a lot of the invisible sort of soft data and the small victories in people's lives that we really appreciate. Yeah. And we document all of these things, of course. Yeah.
Sure. I like this idea of it's soft, some of the soft data, and it almost kind of links back to one of the things that Danya, you were saying about thinking about telling stories. And I wonder how you also link that as a feature as critical in the kind of evidence building and momentum building around this work. Would you like to say a bit about that and more?
I would love to, thank you. On this question of monitoring and evaluation, what my colleagues, friends, future partners here are saying, particularly around timeframes, is really resonating. I was thinking just last week about where are the place-based approaches that have struggled that I've seen. And one of the themes that I think I identified was that when we try to be ambitious about our goals, it's really easy to get overly ambitious about the timeline for those goals. I do this all the time. Talk to anyone on my team. The sense of hope and optimism and purpose that I think we hold to do this work can lead us to be way too optimistic about how long it's going to take to get it done. And so I would offer that it's really important to have rigor around what are the shorter term signs of progress that we think we can get to. I'm just in love with these journey maps that the 20 youth-led communities that we've had the chance to work with over the last 6 years have put together. I'll share a link to them later. But in these journey maps, these are communities that have made really demonstrable changes to youth high school graduation rates, youth engagement in local political life, youth sense of belonging. And along the way toward those goals, which took 6 years to get to, and which in some cases are coming, but we're not there yet because these types of population level changes, all the evidence shows often take 10 to 15 years to get to. Along the way, they've had really dramatic signs of progress. And those signs of progress are related to the heart sets and the mindsets of people doing the work or holding, the governance structures that have been put in place that really center youth voice in this case, policies and systems, and all of these things, these kind of individual, these collaborative, and these policy and sort of shorter term systems changes are a part of the measurement strategy and what we need to evaluate and look for as we get to the larger kind of community-wide changes. I would also add that it's not just about what we're measuring, but how we're creating the space to unpack it. That's really important and rigorous as well. Everything I've learned about collaborative improvement approaches comes from hospitals and comes from engineering and comes from car manufacturing. So really grounded, like you said, not in softness, but in a real rigorous approach. And then when it comes to stories, I think audience matters so much right now. People have shorter attention spans. We are living in an economy where our attention is such an asset and where there's so many ways to get distracted every day. And so I think recognizing that many, many people respond to data, but many, many people respond to stories, written stories, but also the opportunity to hear someone's stories face to face over a cup of tea. Recognizing how people are going to be able to pull information into their hearts and minds is really critical. And so often it's the stories that are the way into people's hearts and minds.
Sure. Thank you for that. Ngaka, you've now sat through quite a lengthy conversation with practitioners. As a person who comes into this as a researcher, comes into the work of working with place, and particularly places that are in the periphery, I wonder if there's anything that is finding resonance from your own research in terms of what has been said at a practice and practitioner level about what is happening in place and how to unlock the power of place, and if there's any cautions you would add from a research perspective about how we need to be having this conversation. Yeah,
I mean, I actually felt that they are more practitioners, and I do observe and report with recommendations. Yeah, and that's actually quite interesting to listen to the conversations. So for me, I think the one thing that really sort of like struck me when we were talking earlier about accountability, especially in places where we don't have Réjane, Danya, and Johan, And me, I'm there as a researcher and I'm seeing all these possibilities and I'm not even sure actually just how to get started. And in my opinion, I'm thinking of two cases here. One is sort of like in the metropolis where the space, of course, like I said, very much potential, but then there is no person who can do that collaboration rated way. And I mean, I even like sort of like tried to get started myself, but then, and I think for me, what I identified there was the municipality as being very, very key because I could bring together the local business people and local organizations. But I was thinking that the municipality was really very much key, not just very in terms of like resources, but just I think in terms of like the credibility to be able to bring together people around the table, even if, for example, I could do the facilitation. So it was actually quite a bit of a challenge to find a place of potential, but a municipality that could really come in, give legitimacy to the whole thing, and bring that collaborative work in an integrated way possible. So that's one thing that I'm not really sure how we proceed in terms of like spaces where accountability, who should really be able to bring the people together. As I said, I do research, I write, and then I recommend. Someone has got to take it further. The other case, there was also another case where actually I think the local major player, because there are different players, but some players are more equal than others, like I said, given the issues of just the place they hold in the space as a municipality, as a traditional authority. And actually, in this case, it was in the context of a traditional authority who was doing all the things that I would really take quite correctly, quite well, and really moving forward further in terms of like facilitatives, like that, facilitating that space to really enable the local people to do what they can do in a very, very interesting way, according to me. But then again, that collaborative was still very much needed at the level now of ideas, because now the challenge became a little bit of about sort of like ideology of how we proceed. In terms of like really what that a very, very good initiative that was being done, whether we embed what needed to be done in the communities, in the localities as they exist, and build bottom up and build with the community. But then in that particular context, the situation was different because then it was almost like creating a new space, a new city, afresh, altogether outside of the existing space. And that actually became a little bit of a problem. And even the players that were actually involved in that began to really have really different sort of like a conflicts, and the whole thing just fell down because they could not really proceed. So, but then the collaboration also at the level around the table where people can really converse about different approaches and really somehow reach some kind of like a way forward in terms of like what could work. So that's really for me one thing that I can contribute here.
Sure. I think you're raising two important points that I think a lot of people might be holding as questions, actually. And the one is about who has the legitimacy, the credibility, and maybe even competence to hold the collaborative work. I mean, Danya, earlier on, you spoke about backbone organizations. Now, that's a term that is well known in a particular context. I wonder if could you provide some perspective on, that question of who can hold this and how have these organizations or players that emerge as backbones, what are their features, what makes them credible, when are they not credible? And maybe that might shed some light on that question actually that's underlining what Ngaka's reflecting on is, the holding of the collaborative work as a start, that first question.
Would you like me to share? Or was that for Ngaka?
Oh, sorry, is my internet?
I'll throw in a bit, and then surely others will want to add as well. How I hear your question is around what is a backbone? What do we mean when we say that? And I think there's a set of functions, and then there's a set of mindsets. So when it comes to the functions, I actually would refer back to the original collective impact article way back from 2012. I think there's still a lot of resonance for me there. But the functions are around bringing people together. They're around ensuring that the data that we just spent some time talking about and the structures for understanding and making sense of and making decisions with that data are present. There's important functions around communications that come back to the ideas of sharing responsibility and sharing attribution of credit that are really central to that role. There's a function around being able to design an arc of work and not just see what needs to come next, but also really keep track of what's come before. And have the ability to celebrate and name and rally people around not just what's ahead, but what we've gotten through together. Many people, now that collaboration and place-based approaches have been around for some time, have had different experience of things that might be called a place-based approach or called a collaboration, but didn't actually hold all of the rigor that we've been talking about. And so they come into these collaborations sometimes a bit skeptical or a bit weary of the idea of yet another collaboration. So the ability to hold all of these functions, not necessarily within a single person or organization, but often across an ecosystem of organizations is how I've come to think about the backbone. The most important function I see is around really holding the deep belief that we can get to a different place and really holding the question all the time of how can I expand my own aspirations and support other people to expand their aspirations for what's possible and our sense of why things are the way they are right now and how we can change them. When it comes to the way that we hold that role, I think it's just like, Sinazo, what you said in the beginning. There's no one consensus on that. Going to the community that's most impacted by what we're trying to work on and the community that we'll be working with to ask the questions of what will it look like if this backbone role is being held well is really important. I often hear, maybe not surprisingly, that it's inclusive, it's transparent, it's humble, it's rigorous, but heartfelt at the same time. But we can't assume what people are going to want from us. So I think it really starts with figuring out the right questions and the right containers in which to ask the questions to figure out the way that we hold those roles.
I don't know if my internet has been a problem. This is the nice thing about having live sessions. But I'm hoping you guys can all hear me and we are back on. Great. I just have one last question before I actually want to open it up to the floor. And this goes to all the panelists. Yeah, we've spoken about what this work is, its features, its mindsets, its principles, its orientations. And I wonder if there's people in the audience who are either funders or part of civil society or an NGO of government, and they want to embrace this, support this work, or start it. Yeah, what is the advice that you would give on how they can best support or begin this work? And anyone can kind of go first.
Okay, I'll if I could jump in, Sinazo. You know, I think what's really important here, and I think it's come through a lot of the comments, is, you know, if you're a funder or government or policymaker or any kind of stakeholder that wants to become part of this work, is to think very carefully about what is replicable and what is not. You know, I think that's something that's quite important with place-based, and even to Ngaka's comments about, you know, if you're in a situation as a researcher and you go into a particular community and then you come and you ask me or Danya or Johan or Sinazo and you say, well, I'm going into this community, so how best do I do it? And you're like, well, you've got to have that humility to say, look, this might have worked here, but it doesn't mean it's replicable somewhere else. And I think that's also very important for place-based, is that we continue to hold that humility, and for a funder or even a policymaker to realize that there will be elements that are replicable, and how you do things, the principles by way you do something, yes, that can be replicable. Doing something with the right amount of care, the right amount of time taken, being responsible, being flexible, being accountable communities, that's replicable in how you do it. But what you do in the particular place might not be. So it could be a place where it's most important to speak to the municipality or to local government, or you could be in a rural area where the traditional leadership is really, really important, and understanding that. So that's not going to be replicable in a city area or a peri-urban area or a different part of the country, a different part of the world. So you've got to be very, very clear about what lessons you're taking from a practitioner or a place or a learning that will be replicable and won't be, and where you can do more harm by assuming that if something worked in one place, it's going to work in another place. But I do think that the how we do things, that can be replicable, and that's been tried and tested, and there's evidence for that. And I think also, just coming to, there's a question in the chat by Dr. Mason, talking about well-being economies and about wellness and about measuring wellness rather than just the data. And I think that is embedded in how place-based interventions look at their data. So when we're talking about data, it's not just numbers of children who passed their ECD, 4 or 5 class, there are data points, just because they're not numbers, but we certainly have those data points, and we can investigate those rigorously, but they could be qualitative data rather than quantitative data, and we can look at wellness and well-being in a rigorous, data-driven way. It doesn't mean that because it's not a particular number that it isn't data and it can't be done rigorously. So just to answer a question that was raised in the chat about, do you look to that? You certainly do, and you certainly do evaluate it, and it's ongoing evaluation that's done, particularly around wellness and well-being.
Yeah.
Can I go? Sorry,
Yeah.
Tanya. Can I? No, I think, and we always think through these things because it must be applicable and practical and all that. But I think for a community, it's such a powerful tool or framework or approach to just organize themselves around issues that's really clear and dear to them. I think it really helps a community or a residents to be in a better place to go negotiate with their local municipality or with some of the bigger businesses in the area. And so from a community level, I really think that's really powerful for that. From a government level, Ngaka, so I think municipalities can really go into that. And I think for funders, I just think it's better over time to partner with an organized local community that understands who they are and what they can do, so that you don't every year need to find new projects to say ESG or SDG or whatever. I think it's really just sustainable to partner at that level with communities that's really working hard with what they have, and in the places where they are. I think it's just more sustainable for investment over the long term, yeah.
Thanks, Johan. Oh, there we go, Ngaka. Sorry, internet challenges.
Right. I mean, I'm thinking here of like 4 different cases that I try to draw from in terms of like what I'm going to make, because I don't want to like sort of like overgeneralize. So I have observed, like, for example, in one case, you have like this corporate body institution that is really, really willing to pump money into an area, and a religious institution also trying to coordinate that, being in between the corporate body and the community. and really indeed money coming in and the project starting, really, really interesting kind of like work in an informal settlement kind of like setting, a mining kind of like area, really, really disadvantaged kind of an area. And then something happened. So I think the point I'm trying to say is that the cooperative work is just as good as the individual players who are involved in that sort of like collaborative work. Because what actually happened with this particular case study is that the person basically just went away with the money. I don't know how he managed to work with the bank to be able to get all that lump sum and just like went away. And I'm talking here about something of the early 2000s. So even now, when you go back to that community, the community has not been able to recover from that, to actually move forward with that. So I think to the funders, it's more like really making sure that the local players in the community are as capacitated as possible to make sure that what you put in is not necessarily going to get lost. And so in other case, actually, which is another extreme now here, another community, in this case, which is very much well-resourced, doesn't actually that much need money from the outside because it gets a royalty from the mining companies. Obviously, they would need money in terms of like they would need investment from outside for kind of like a job creation and all of that in the broader scheme of things. I'm not saying they don't really need anything from in the inside, but again, for me, it takes me back to that issue of trying to find a way of, from different standpoints, different way in which people look at things, how then do people actually have conversations to be able to find a way of moving forward. So these two extreme cases where one would need money to come in and the institutions, local institutions are not that much capacitated, and then another one where the possibilities really exist, but then it's just the modalities of operations which are lacking because people are not really sitting around the table altogether. The people that need to be around the table to be able to have a way of moving forward with the projects and programs.
Thanks. That's a very good caution, not to over-romanticize people in communities. Not all of them are about community. Danya, would there be anything that you would add just as a closing point around how people can support this approach or start it?
Yeah, let me add maybe 3 things to this piece around funding and money. The first is, I'm going to go back to holding your powerful roles. You know, place-based approaches isn't something that any of us deliver. It's something we support. It means investing in relationships, being a student of what those most harmed by current systems have already told us, holding not to a particular goal, but to how we engage and how we share power and how we clarify how decisions will be made. And so I think really asking those that you're working with what roles you can play, digesting what you hear, and then being really honest about what roles you can play based on the constraints that you have, the container that you're in, is really helpful. I think the folks from Synergos are here. They've taught me a lot about this idea of holding roles over the years here. The second thing I would say is, you know, one asset that we have right now is a growing body of information around trust-based philanthropy. And when I think about trust-based philanthropy and read what communities are asking for, I see things like we've talked about here: funding the process, not the outcomes, staying long enough to matter, supporting learning communities, aligning with other funders so that collectively many funders are each bringing their unique and powerful roles to building an ecosystem of approaches. Again, there's a growing body of information on what these kinds of approaches look like. And I think for all of us to study what those are and experiment where we can will be really powerful. And the last thing I just want to say is I think there's something very important about being a student of capital. Asking ourselves what perceptions and norms we want to shift when it comes to money, what it's for and how it flows, will do so much to create the adequate, durable, long-term resourcing that communities need to do place-based work. One of our colleagues, Dr. Mason, in the chat shared some examples of what different capital approaches can look like. I would also point to Ethical Fields in Australia as an organization doing amazing work around place-based capital. So thinking about how we grant, spend, invest our assets and influence the public policy that dictates those uses, I think is very important too.
Sure. Thank you. Folks, we are out of time. There are a few questions in the chatbot that haven't been addressed. I would like to encourage our panelists to please engage those offline if possible, but also we will share links on our socials to these organizations so that you can, as an audience, get a bit more information if this has sparked curiosity and more questions for you. This has been such a rich conversation about a very complex field of work. And I think you've done, as panelists, such a good job of, sharing that complexity and nuance with also a lot of clarity. So I just want to say thank you to you and thank you to the audience.